morning, everyone. Perfect. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Christy Allen. I'm a Knowledge Translation and Implementation Coordinator with the Waypoint Research Institute, and really excited to welcome you to today's Waypoint Talks session. Today's session is around the value of lived experience in IPV research and perspectives from lived experience co-researchers. To start us off, we would like to do a land acknowledgement. The Waypoint Research Institute is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, which include the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee, Huron, Wendat, and Métis peoples. We acknowledge and affirm our commitment to improving relationships between nations and to improving equity for Indigenous communities residing in the Central North region of Ontario. And if you'd like, we encourage you to share in the chat where you're joining us from this morning. So, welcome to Waypoint Talks. Waypoint Talks is a virtual webinar series that is hosted by the Waypoint Research Institute, and we aim to highlight the practical implications of research projects. So we also have another series around building your research toolkit that aims to highlight best practices used in mental health research, quality improvement, and program implementation. And these events are open to all who are interested in learning about emerging research, best practices, and clinical innovation. And today's talk is part of a 4-part series for the month of April around IPV co-research. So just a couple quick housekeeping notes. This is hosted as a Zoom webinar, so please use the chat box and the Q&A function to connect with speakers and your fellow attendees. And there will be dedicated time at the end of the presentation for questions and discussions. The recording and slides will be available post-event on the WRI website. And we also will send out a post-event survey, so we do appreciate you filling that out. It does help inform our future events. And there are also attendance certificates available for professional development. We'll share more about how to access these at the end of the presentation. So over to today's speakers. We're really pleased to have 4 wonderful speakers with us and our host, Ashley Melvin. So I'd like to welcome Kimia, Asadpour, Dr. Daniely, Sciorotta, Kristin Smith, and Haley MacDonald. And I'll pass it over to you, Ashley.
Awesome, thank you. Maybe it would be good if each of our panelists gave just a quick introduction on their background, and maybe we can start in any order. I won't call anyone out, but if anyone would like to go and introduce themselves first.
I can go ahead.
Sure, go ahead, Daniely, thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Daniely. I'm a postdoctoral scholar, Department of Psychology, University of Guelph. I've been involved in IPV research for several years. My research explores the connection between homelessness, housing stability, and IPV, and how these influences affect women, health, and well-being using social cultural lens. And I'm happy to be part of this conversation today and listen to my colleagues as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniely. Kristin, would you like to take your turn to introduce yourself? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, my name is Kristin Smith. I'm a registered professional counselor here in Saskatoon. I have private practice here, and I'm here with lived experience. I was caught in the family court system for about a decade, so not just the personal experience with IPV, but the systemic effects of leaving an intimate partner relationship. So that lasted for about 10 years, like I said. And I also support a lot of women in my practice who have experienced IPV as well.
Thank you. And Kimia, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Kimia, and thanks to everyone who is here today. Just a little bit of information about me. I was always interested in human behavior and human mind, and the science behind of it. So I studied psychology at York University, and I worked for Queen's University online psychotherapy lab for some time. And I volunteered as a responder at the Stress Center of Greater Toronto, and I'm a person with lived experience. So yeah, that's
awesome.
it.
Thanks so much. And last but not least, Haley.
Good morning. I'm Haley MacDonald. I am a feminist activist. I've been doing this work for well over a decade. I like to think that since I was a little girl, feminism has been something that has been in my blood, and it really guides all of the work that I do. Currently, I'm the executive director of a nonprofit in Ontario that's working to end all violence against all women. And I've been here for a decade and really seen over the last bit of time how the realities of violence against women continue to change. And myself as well am a person with lived experience of violence.
Awesome. And welcome, panel and our attendees. It's really clear that everyone has a very unique background, and we're all kind of tied to this topic in different and slightly similar ways, I think, which is really unique. And to start us off, for my first question, I'd like to ask you all, what brought you to IPV research or advocacy? And you guys can go in any order you feel comfortable.
I'll start.
Okay.
For me, it was the lived experience of the systemic experiences I had, being in family court for 10 years. Seeing, I guess we are always taught that, family court systems and police and child protection are there to help us and to do what's right and what's safe. That wasn't my experience at all. So I knew I knew for a long time when I was in it that I wanted to be a part of a change. And because I started to realize it wasn't uncommon what I was experiencing. And once I was kind of out of all of it, I started meeting other women and realizing how prevalent this issue actually is. And when we talk about the statistics, 1 in 3 women. Everybody kind of knows that 1 in every 3 women have experienced or will experience intimate partner violence, and that's just police reported. So we know those numbers are a lot higher. And being in Saskatchewan, knowing our rates are over double the national average, for me, I knew that my lived experience would have value in changing some of those systemic processes. So that for me, it's really important that I can maybe be part of a change so other women and children don't have to experience what I went through.
Thank you, Kristin. And would any of our other panelists like to speak a little bit about what brought you to intimate partner violence research or advocacy?
I can share.
Yeah.
So personally, I think with my own experience with IPV, the person who is experiencing IPV is actually a victim unless they do something about it. So personally, participation in these projects and other similar projects actually helped me to change my victimhood mindset to survivor, and also understanding the scientific aspect of it through research to raise awareness is actually so important to me, and this project gave me that channel to use.
Thank you for sharing. And Daniely or Haley, would either of you like to jump in and talk a little bit about your own perspective?
Yes, sure. During my academic journey, I began meeting women with health issues that are connected with intimate partner violence, which made me realize the importance to explore these issues, and I'm exploring up to now. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think for myself, I actually started in, I think, like I say, as a feminist, I remember in high school building, an athletic council because I noticed that, women's sport weren't as celebrated as men's sport. And then I think when you start having that lens of inequality, I went to university and started my undergrad as a kinesiology student and ended up in a women and gender studies course. And I think from somebody who came from a home that was characterized by gender-based violence, entering a women and gender studies course was so empowering, and I immediately switched my undergraduate degree because I felt like, and similar to your experience, Kristin, when you understand that the systems are upholding the experiences of intimate partner violence, of gender-based violence, of sexual violence, which we know is so increased when you go into post-secondary institutions, it just made me feel liberated. And I think my experience and my family's experience went from this place of, wow, something tragic has happened to us, to, wow, this is a systemic problem. And if it's a systemic problem, then there's a systemic solutions. And I became really inspired to be part of that. And uh, if feminism was able to be my therapy, I felt like, well, if we could run organizations through that same lens, what is going to be the tremendous impact of that to so many others?
That's amazing. Thank you all for sharing. My next question, and feel free to jump in your view, what does it truly mean to center lived experience in intimate partner violence research?
For me, it is about, I think we who have experienced the effects of intimate partner violence and all the outcomes that come along with it. When Daniely said health outcomes, I'm like, I'm poster child for health outcomes, like autoimmune disorders from this and chronic health issues from it. We know, like, to our core where the issues have been in our systems. So when we talk about in other research conversations we've had about, either being partners or experts in this, I think that that's really incredible value because, again, we have those felt senses. We know we've been kind of let down in the processes. So to be centered in the lived experience and research, to be able to feel as valuable as the academics who do this, I think is going to be powerful in changing some of the dynamics in our system.
I think from my perspective, it's the only way that we should be doing this work. I think as well, the saying "nothing about us without us" is something that really resonates with me. We in our organization, we don't design or do anything without it coming from the women in our programs. And when we do that, one, we recognize, like myself as an individual with lived experience of violence, it looks and feels so different than so many other folks. And I think that's when you get into the lens of intersectionality and recognizing that there's so many social locations that change the way that you go through the world and change the different systems of oppression that you're experiencing or coming up against. And I think that um, if if we're truly going to do this work, we have to center the voices of women with lived experience of violence because there's also just a pragmatic component to that. When we ask the women in our programs, how do you think we can end all violence against all women, or what do you think we need? There is a today action to be taken. And I think that's really important because we can often go into, and I know this when I did my master's thesis, into these, this is what it needs to look like. These are the systems that we need to erode and interrupt and changes that need to happen. But there's also a on the ground today, what can we do? And these are the things that we need to address the fact that in this moment, we have so many women in violence against women shelters across this country. In this moment, our organization and our small area is serving over 1,000 women a year who have experienced gender-based violence. So how are we addressing that now? And I think they can design the most innovative programs. We have a hydroponic farm social enterprise in Midland in an old LCBO. That program came from the women in service. They told us what they wanted and what they needed, and we built something that has had the biggest impact, in my opinion, out of any of the other programs that we've designed. And I think, again, that goes to it's because their voices are front and center. And still today, they make the decisions when we are changing programming. We come to them once a month and say what's working, what's not working, and make design changes from there.
I agree with the insights offered my colleagues. In my perspective, putting living experience at the center of IPV research means ensuring that survivors are not just subjects of the research, right? But active partners in all the process. So they need to be involved in all stages, not just about collecting data, but is shaping the research questions and methodologies that reflect the lived experiences. So in my perspective, when IPV survivors are involved from the beginning, the year's insights help to shape the research, the questions, and the methodology, and really reflect about the real life concerns and the needs of this community. So I think this approach helps to understand and try to change the power imbalances. So I see it this way. Thanks.
I agree with everything that has been said. And I think basically centering lived experience in IPV means humanizing it. And the voices, perspective, and realities of individuals who have experienced IPV are at the forefront. And at the end, survivors, as it has been said, are experts and they know what works for them and what doesn't in intervention, support system. And it's not just an academic standpoint, but it is also about acknowledging diversity and nuances in each person's story.
Thank you, everyone. And my next question for you is, how has being involved in research as a person with lived experience impacted you, either personally or professionally?
I have a brief point to make up about this. As a researcher, I'm involved in every step of the research, so for me it's a little different. And I will try to do my best to ensure that survivors' voices are included in every stage. So that's all I have to say about this question. However, I really like to hear my colleagues to speak. So I pass the floor to my colleagues, and I believe their expertise on this topic is much more to share in this matter that I have. Thanks.
I can share.
Go ahead,
So
Kristin.
personally, and it's just started doing a lot of advocacy and being a part of a research project this year. And I can't say it enough how much healing that brings to the experiences that I've had. To actually be believed and be heard and understood after, a decade of being not believed, being re-victimized, being minimized for my experience because I wasn't battered and bruised. The coercive control piece is really important to me because that was a lot of my experience. And I think that doing the research and bringing awareness to pieces of intimate partner violence such as that are really important. So again, being believed and just being a part of this is empowering. That again, like Kimia said, going from victim to survivor is really powerful. To be able to do something and have a voice, because when we're in those intimate partner violence relationships, we don't have a voice. We're voiceless. So it's been very healing. And professionally too, I really find value in when women come into my office and they're sharing this to me, my lived experience, and then being part of research, I can help better support and direct women in a way where it's like, you don't just encourage them, go to family court. You're gonna be heard. You're gonna be believed. You're gonna, keep your kids safe. Go to the police. Like, I'm very aware of systemic issues that we have. So I feel like it can also help keep women a little safer as well in that aspect of not sending them blindly into systems that aren't doing what they're actually supposed to do. So professionally, being in this research that just validated, I'm not the only one in this experience of being not only let down by our systems, but actually having them cause more harm. So professionally, I think that helps as well to be really not just have the lived experience, but to be a part of the research and to know that these are collectively issues, not just experienced by me, but by a lot of women. So again, just helping women be cautioned and providing them with the right supports that I know are out there from other organizations that I've been able to connect with through lived experience. So, yeah.
Amazing. Thank you, Kristin. I'm wondering if Kimia or Haley, if you could share your perspectives.
Yeah, as Kristin said, being involved in research is both empowering and healing. Like knowing that my experiences can contribute to making real changes in the system is so empowering. And raising awareness through using research is actually really, really healing. And it is amazing how we all somehow share the same kind of experience. That's amazing to hear.
Yeah, I think it really depends. I think that we can be involved, and I really like what you said, Daniely, is I've been involved in research that has felt as a service provider that it's been really supportive and a space where we're all in this together and we're trying to create change. And then I've also been involved in research where it feels problematic and it feels like I don't want to be in that space. And you can be really isolated and othered as a person, as the person to be investigated if you have lived experience of violence, so you're like the test subject, or we often, as service providers, we can get oh, that's cute, you provide services in the realm of academia. And I think that you know um that's a really frustrating place to be. Whereas I know in the project that we've been working on recently with Elnaz and you, Ashley, it's felt so different. And why? I think it's felt so different because we come together and everybody's voices feel very equal. And there's space carved out in an agenda that isn't just for an academic update. We talk about current events, we talk about the realities of things, and we're all really recognizing that there's so many different types of knowledge and that we create space for that knowledge to be shared so that nobody feels like an imposter at that table. And I think that's really important because as a service provider, our organization every year fundraises. This year, our budget was approved last night. We have $500,000 to fundraise to keep our services status quo. Research allows us to um, it allows us to make an argument and apply for funding and be more successful. If we can't tell the story as to why this work is important, as to the impacts, we actually can't articulate why our services are needed. So there's a really pragmatic component as well. And that's why I was excited to be part of this project, is because I think one, it helps us create the narrative for funding in our sector. It really validates that. And the other piece that I think is really important is it's also liberating. We're on the ground doing the work. And when you're on the ground doing the work, it's really hard sometimes to get back into the office. We have our team does this work every day. Our shelter is busy. Our sexual assault center is busy. And it can often feel like we're just doing things day after day. And in the summer, we had a femicide in our community in Midland, and a young girl of 23 lost her life to intimate partner violence. And those days are really hard to come back into the office after that. And I think that when you then have a meeting to talk about research and to talk about the path forward, it makes that day easier because it feels like you're not just on the hamster wheel, that change is meant to happen and change is going to happen. So I think those spaces are so important because they elicit a piece of hope that the future is going to be different. And that hope is essential, not just for academics, but for service providers and for women who have lived experience of violence.
Thank you, Haley. And in terms of the subject, kind of we're on the subject of change, that leads really well into my next question. What changes would you like to see in how academic or institutional research teams engage with survivors to create a safe and supportive environment?
I can continue there if that's just because I know I started. I think there's multiple pieces here, and I one piece that I will stick to is recognizing there's no universal survivor. There's no universal individual who's experienced violence. And we have to integrate a intersectional approach. And part of that includes harm reduction. Our organization was one of the first shelters in Ontario to fully integrate harm reduction. And what that looks like is we often carve out spaces for a good client or a good individual or a good victim and of violence, and that isolates folks who aren't that narrative, and very few of us are. We know that substance use is a coping mechanism for gender-based violence, yet so often we create spaces where a substance user wouldn't be comfortable in that space. They might experience stigma in that space. We know there's correlation between poverty and lived experience of violence. And again, I say never have a meeting unless you're going to feed people. You don't know what somebody's reality is to come into that space. And I think that's really important. And language use is really important as well. That we use the same language all the time that makes people feel included in a space. Clinical language is so isolating. It's something that makes us feel lesser than or that we can't keep up. And I think that that's really important when we're engaging survivors is we try really hard in our organization to take the language of theory out of the questions of engagement. And so we don't go through, this is the framework we're using to ask these questions. We just try and create a space where people feel safe and they can guide their own pathway to provide feedback in a way that's comfortable for them with lots of breaks and lots of food. And I think those are really important pieces to engaging people with lived experience in the work.
One change I'd like to see is academic research should work on creating welcome space where survivors feel comfortable and share their ideas and concerns. And as Haley described it very well, it's encouraging to know that many IPV research are now focused on this and giving equal space to everyone. Give us some kind of hope. Thanks.
I just want to add.
Go ahead.
I just want to add that focusing on trauma-informed practices is actually, I think it's so important to ensure that the spaces is emotionally and mentally safe and supportive. And the other thing that actually I think Haley mentioned is the terms that we use. I think we need to be more focused on using the terms that are positively oriented, such as empowering, instead of the language that is more tend to be more negative. I think these are some of the things that we should focus on.
Yeah, I echo everything everybody said so far, and I don't have a lot to say about this just because I've just started in this kind of research community. But language is something I really echo. The other piece too is when we talk about creating a safe space, being mindful of one of the pieces that just comes to mind is, some women have had their children apprehended by disclosing their environment, what their environment's like, and if there's some biases in our systems towards certain cultures or groups of people, which we know that there is, which is also another problem. How do we create safety for them to to just to give them that safety of disclosing without them being worried about their children being apprehended? Because, professionally, I've come across many women who have had their children apprehended without any due process, and that has led them more into addictions. And then it just cycle perpetuates, and it's really harmful. So I think creating that safe space in letting them know clearly what would have to be present for that to actually happen. So just again, creating that safety for those women, because we don't, again, know what all of their experiences have been. So just keeping in mind that could have been experiences of women coming into this, but also when it comes to having women come into these groups to speak, how do we present that in a way to let them know that it is a safe space? Because those are some of the women that have had many harms done to them. So they may not even want to participate, but their participation may be very valuable. So that's just something that comes to mind when I hear that question.
So we've talked a little bit about language and safety with this last question, and I'm curious to know what the panel thinks about, practices that could be included that would promote safety, or, specific language that might be empowering versus disempowering. If we could outline that like really clearly, what do you think that would look like in research?
I'm a huge proponent of eliminating acronyms. I really struggle when we say IPV because it's intimate partner violence. That's huge for somebody who has experienced intimate partner violence. I just think we do a disservice to how heavy those terms can be sometimes. And so, and I think as well, we talk about gender-based violence because we know like intimate partner violence can include so many pieces. And so, and it was interesting. I did research in our social enterprise, and one of my learnings came from I asked women what types of violence they had experienced, and we had a list, or I had a list, and it was, psychological, verbal, physical, sexual. What I didn't have on the list was intimate partner violence or domestic violence. And so women added that to the list, which I thought was also really interesting, just as an aside, that I think, uh, there's an understanding that violence is so much more than just like those 9 items that we always go to. And I don't know if it's because something was missing, or they needed something that could capture the gravity of what have been experienced. So I think I'm not a proponent for acronyms, because I think sometimes when we do the work, those words become easy for us to swallow, and when we're bringing other people into the space, that maybe that's not the case. And so I'm always conscious of that. I think another thing is we don't use the term, and this is something that's debated, but we don't say survivors. And we say like women who have survived gender-based violence. And part of that is like, I think it was you, Kimia, who said humanizing individuals is so important. So we really try to have a human-centered approach, the same way that, when we're looking at if we're integrating harm reduction and we're trying to ensure that everybody feels safe in a space, that we're talking about like women who cope with trauma through substance use. We don't use that word addict when we're talking about women. And I think the other place is like being adaptable in that language. So if women are describing themselves in certain ways, that's the language that we like, we can use, or we can kind of share back. Like in our programs, we often have women say, well, I'm an addict, and there's shame that's tied to that. And we try to go back to them and say, you're a woman who survives so much and you cope through substance use. That feels so different. And I think that all of our spaces, research included, can really start to make those tangible changes in language to really bring people in. And yeah, I think that the kind of the last piece I'll go to is uh, being in this field for the length of time that I have been now. You go into spaces, and I'll take an example. I curl, and you go to the curling club and you sit around the table after a game and you're chatting with folks. It is so often that somebody discloses that they've experienced gender-based violence when you tell them what you're doing. And I always now speak in a way that tries to make folks not feel othered because you never know who you're sitting around. And I think that that's really important when we're in those spaces with researchers is if you were speaking to an individual who has survived gender-based violence in that moment, how would they want to be reflected in your language? And it's humanizing, it has to be respectful, and it has to be an understanding that there's no victim blaming tied to that. And I think those are kind of some of the language components I would consider.
Thank you, Haley. Does anyone else have anything to add on how we can promote safety in research or even specific language considerations we should have? Okay, I can move on to our next question. Thank you, Haley. So many people are curious about how co-researchers balance this work with everything else in their lives. How do you make time for this kind of partnership, and what helps make it doable or meaningful for you?
For me, I make it doable because it's so important to me. Like there's a fire that lights inside of me when I do this work. Um, and so that's exciting for me to do that work. And that's what keeps me motivated to do it. It's like my number one thing that kind of like, again, lights that fire inside of me. And when we talk about, what are our passions in life and what are our things that keep us wanting to be in life, it is that deep for me. So that's what keeps me motivated is just the excitement in my body to know that there is traction in this issue and being in a room with other like-minded women is so supporting that I just want to do it and I want to do it all the time and even when I'm tired. And so when there's weeks that I'm just feeling drained, I've always noticed that when I have these conversations, I am energized almost for the rest of my week. Although it is draining at the same time, there's just these two things that coexist together, which is so confusing in the body because it's energizing and I'm passionate about it. So I love making time for it, even when there isn't a lot of time. And on the other side, it can be draining because bringing up these experiences, we can't deny the experiences in our body, so it can be depleting as well. So, um, making time for it, again, is that part I can just do, but finding support in that as well, and knowing when I'm doing these meetings, what I'm going to need after, is something that I also prepare for too.
Thank you, Kristin. Is there any other panel member who can speak to trying to balance participating in research with, other commitments in life or work?
So I totally agree with Kristin and everything she said. As people, as individuals who experienced IPV, we actually know the intensity of the issue. So I think just knowing the intensity and the seriousness of the issue gives us that motive and that internal passion to help as much as we can, contribute as much as we can, such as like in research.
I feel that we owe it to the women in our programs to do this. Kind of the hamster wheel that I described before. If we're not carving out time to change the future, then are we really doing what we wake up every day to do? And I think that's why I'm so grateful for academics to build space for service to providers to be part of research because of how important it is in our commitment to working to end all violence against all women. We we really need this space because it's change-making space.
I agreed with the insights offered for Haley, Kimia, and Kristin. And what makes me feel um, hopeful is belief that we are chances to improvements and truly help survivors. Um, in my view, this can only happen uh, if we give voices to them and with the help of service providers. And yeah, it's it's a really important work, and I agree with all my colleagues said.
Can I just add something?
Of course, yeah.
You know, when 5 years ago when I started my career as a counselor, um, I never intended on being a counselor. Through my process, I actually went back to school to speak educatedly about children's development and human development and the impacts of intimate partner violence and children's safety because of the harm that was done to me. Because I knew that in our systems, I was just going to be viewed as the angry mom who didn't get her way in court. So now she's, making noise. And I knew that very clearly that was the case, that I wasn't going to be heard. Um, and it was just my experience was going to be wasted. Like I felt like I went through all of it for nothing. So I went back to school to do that. It all trickled off into me realizing that was my path in life, and here I am, now, which is a beautiful silver lining. But I think that you know being that voice when you didn't think that you were going to be heard, and to now be heard, is really important to me. So yeah, so I just wanted to share that.
Thank you so much, Kristin. I'm so glad that in your research experiences, you've found that opportunity to be heard, and it kind of ties into that silver lining. That's amazing. My next question for the group is, are there any specific challenges that are associated with being involved in lived experience research?
In my perspective, I think is the emotional impact when we must revisit painful memories. So it's important to be attention and ready and well prepared to deal with this and understand that emotional work involved in this research. Yeah, I think is that my main concern.
So I just want to quote Elnaz and Ashley because they have mentioned this in our previous meetings, that because of the online aspect of the research, the online aspect of the project actually makes it harder to verify someone's background or the authenticity of their experience. And the other thing is, while online research can make it easier for more people to participate, it can feel disconnected sometimes comparing to in-person settings. So it needs more extra care and attention.
I think too, in our programs, we at one point did a survey and it was close to 25% of women didn't have computer or internet in their home. And so that in itself is just a barrier. And I think, going back to the nothing about us without us, their flexibility is so critical. So I think where we struggle is we will often, if we're doing research, we might set up interviews with women every hour for a day. And, you will have maybe 2 out of 8 women show up, and it's just the rigidity of you're talking to this person at 11 a.m. This is what this looks like is really difficult when we know that there's still violence in our lives causes chaos, and chaos does not allow for us to always adhere to a colonial construct such as time and a 9 a.m. start. And, I think something I've learned that I'm still learning because it's one of my biggest struggles is the concept of space and adding more space into things so that if a woman's not there at 10, but she's there at 11:30, there's still space for her voice to be included. Um, and I feel that sometimes when we talk a lot about confidentiality and lived experience and wanting to do things in interviews because we want to have a one-on-one space where somebody can have complete confidentiality when they're sharing that experience, and that's great. But gender-based violence is also very isolating, and there's so much shame tied to those experiences. And so when we're kept in isolation with our stories of gender-based violence, that sometimes can perpetuate some of that shame of I'm alone here and I'm telling this story to this researcher. So I found in our work, we tend to have the most involvement and the most engagement when we're holding focus groups for women to come in and sit with one another. It almost feels like the shame that we hold so deep in our core begins to be eroded, and we create a space where it's not just a woman who has experienced violence stuck in that narrative of the survivor. She also gets to be the supporter to the woman beside her and the advocate to the woman in front of her and the really angry person for the woman across from her. And I think that that's just so valuable. Kristin, I love when you talk about how liberating research has been. And I think sometimes how do we build that liberation into those moments of women when they're coming in to share their experiences to inform research or to inform programs?
Yeah, I really like what you said, Haley. I think that's so important. And again, it goes back to feeling understood, feeling seen, feeling supported, and being believed when we have not been believed for so long. So the value in that is just it's invaluable, really. And for me, again, going back to the empowerment of being in that group, it's or in a group of women that are supportive and nobody minimizes anything you've experienced or be like, well, this happened to me, or it's well, it could be worse. It's that doesn't exist in these spaces from my experience. And um, for my personal experience, what that really does for me in this research is this internal this internal celebration to all of the judges and social workers and police that minimized my experience and didn't believe me, that I had to beg to be heard, where I almost fell apart and didn't make it in life. There's lots of days, and I'm sure other people in this room may have experienced this, where you don't want to live anymore. So to be in a group and a system like that and a part of this research, it makes you want to live, and it almost rights that wrong inside the body. That's what it feels like for me.
Thank you so much for sharing, Kristin. Daniely, I'm curious about your perspective on this one. As a researcher, what kind of challenges do you see in involving co-researchers in your work?
I think my perspective is research create real connections with the communities. This is my main concern. And building trust and being transparent through the entire process. And also have concerns to be inclusive with terms and languages, as my colleagues mentioned, so everyone can participate equally, and trying to minimizing the power relation, right?
Awesome, thank you. And on the note of inclusivity, in what ways can intimate partner violence research shift to be more inclusive and reflective of the needs of diverse, equity, diverse and equity denied communities, especially those that are often unrepresented in marginalized who are marginalized in the data.
So I think creating a culturally responsive space for newer individuals with diverse backgrounds so that they can share and just talk about their experiences is so important. Like personally, with my cultural background, blaming the victim is huge. Like just you telling and sharing your story and other people just believe you or take the time to hear you is so big. And knowing this, I think, is so important with in research area, comparing to different cultures, that people are more aware about IPV and issues like this. So being culturally responsive can create that space for people to just come and share. And I think it's really important to know the historical background of IPV in different and specific communities.
Yeah, just to add on to what Kimia said is understanding to like communities, some communities may not respond well to structured questions. There may be more story sharers. So to be able to go in and have an idea of what we want to know, and I guess the questions to ask, but more of an in-person without the structured like what we do on video, right? So knowing what communities will respond well to this versus which communities won't respond well to this way.
I would like to say that I agree with the Kimia and Kristin said. And I guess the key to respond or overcome these challenges um, is to recognize the unique experiences of these communities and ensure that the design, for example, of the research address the needs of survivors.
Yeah, I agree with everything my colleagues have said. I think that not only recognizing the unique experiences of the women or survivors that you're working with, I think another piece is recognizing the social locations of yourself as a researcher is really important because we don't know our biases, we don't know our limitations without truly doing that self-reflection to understand what is my social location and where are the areas that my privilege isn't allowing me to see. And I think that's really critical to this work. I would say, um, one of the ways IPV research can shift, just kind of reading that question again, is we I talked about this before, but I can't emphasize it enough. There seems to be a narrative as to who is an acceptable individual who has experienced violence and so much harm. Places that we see that so much is the engagement of criminalized women. And oftentimes, even a lot of programming funded through the Ministry of the Attorney General, you cannot access certain supports if you're also a perpetuator of crime. And so, if you've experienced intimate partner violence, you might want to access Path A, but if you have also yourself been engaged in aggravated assault, you might not be able to access that same path in the same way. Our programs don't really at times capture the full components of what it means to be human, what it means to have experienced violence, what has led you to condone violence yourself. And we did focus groups recently, and a woman really illustrated that for me. She was assaulted by her partner. She responded by assaulting her partner, and she was then charged with assault against her partner. And the next time she was assaulted, she didn't call for support again. And I think it's really important that our questions engage women who have been criminalized, who have experienced gender-based violence, and that we break down the barriers to do that. And that also includes, and I really loved what you said, Kristin, understanding that sometimes recording things can cause harm because we don't know, is that going to go to a CAS worker? Is this information, if I'm disclosing in a focus group that my way of making income is through illicit, like sales of illicit substances, that like I'm criminalizing myself further. So I think it's like creating spaces that are also safe so that individuals can share something. Obviously, there's a duty to report line that can't be crossed, but even making that clear from the beginning of, at this moment, we will have to do a duty to report. And at times we'll even pause, we'll interrupt and say, just going to stop. Remember, at this point, there is a duty to report. And I just want to like put that back into the space to see, do we want to continue? And so I think, really that engagement of women who have been criminalized is so important. We see that in our human trafficking program. More than half of the people involved in that program also have criminal charges themselves. And that experience, the holistic nature of their reality can often be erased from the narratives of individuals who have experienced violence.
I really love that you brought that to attention, Haley, because it is, we don't in our system seem to really understand reactive abuse that much. And it's just like, nope, you did this and now you're being charged. And it's like, it is so complex. And again, I think this research is really important too, in that sense of really educating our systems on what abuse actually is and how we're impacted by it, especially as women. And again, I think there's an imbalance that we see in, perpetrators being charged versus, the reactive abuse, and then women being charged, and then us not trusting the system. And I also like what you said, Haley, about the duty to report being really clear and then giving the woman choice. Do you want to continue, rather than just letting them go or just saying, now I have to report? So again, that safety of choice is, I think, something that we're lacking in the space sometimes, is choice.
Thank you, everyone. And one of my next questions is, what advice would you give to someone with lived experience of intimate partner violence if they're beginning a research or advocacy journey?
For me, it's just to have supports in place, know how you're impacted by having these conversations, and know what you need in order to move through this process in a healthy way for yourself. Supports.
And I think, as Kristin mentioned before, this work can be both rewarding and emotionally taxing and triggering. So I think prioritizing yourself is one of the important components of this work. And for me, something that I wish someone had told me is that my lived experience is not only valid, but it can also be used to make changes. And that's empowering.
I believe that Kristin and Kimia have already covered all points. I think they explained very well about the support, the triggering, and prioritize yourself. I feel that they shared my thoughts.
I think the advice I would give somebody is to just know that they belong there. Like I just think people need to know you belong here. There's no space you don't belong in. And I agree with everybody. Yeah, your voice matters, and what you're thinking of doing is important. And I think sometimes that's the hardest place is to think, well, what I have to say doesn't matter. And it really does.
Thank you all. And now, before we move on to questions from the audience, our final question is, what gives you hope right now in this space? And what's one action you think everyone here can take after today's session to help center lived experience more meaningfully in research?
What gives me hope is seeing a growing recognition of lived experience research. More and more, I see researchers seeking out survivors' input and working to create a collaborative environment. As I'm seeing in this research in my lab, and I work closely with this research who believe in this approach, is something that brings hope to me. And in my perspective, one thing everyone can do is commit me to listen and respecting survivors' voices in every aspect of the research, from the design to dissemination. And I think it's important to advocate to their meaningful involvement in future studies. We need to always remind this and highlight all the time, and sometimes explain many times why it's important, IPV survivors' expertise. Yeah, I think this is my thoughts.
So I agree with everything that Daniely said. The only thing that I want to add is that people need to educate themselves for IPV just on a personal level. It's so important to know what is going on, what is IPV, because people outside of this experience, they think, oh, it's just easy to leave. Why they just don't leave? And they don't know the dynamic. And I just hope that we can raise awareness by educating ourselves about the topic. And that is so important, because I personally, I would question my mom of why she doesn't leave until I experienced it personally and I understood to my core the dynamic and what is actually going on that people can't leave. And I think just educate yourself. It's so important.
I like what you just said about, bringing awareness to and educating ourselves about the language we also use. And this is something I, hope to see shift in our society as a whole, is shifting language from why doesn't she leave to why is he abusing her? Moving from, headlines of, woman victimized by whatever to perpetrator did this to woman. The language that we use is all focused on, us, and there's little focus in language on the perpetrators of violence. And it really gets me a bit fired up when we keep using this language. And I hope that our systems decide to change that, because you're right. Saying, why didn't she just leave? It is way harder than anybody can ever imagine who's never experienced it. And it's not just the will to leave, it's a biological shift from the psychological damage that's done in that system. The brain actually gets so connected in so many ways to the abuser that it's not even like logic doesn't matter at that point, So understanding, like Kimia said, about educating ourselves on intimate partner violence and the deep impacts that it has on human development is something that I think there's a huge gap in as a whole in our society, because it's not easy to leave. And you'll even hear police officers saying that, well, why don't you just leave? And it's like, it's not that easy. So I think, just again, echoing what you said about educating ourselves on the deepness of intimate partner violence, because it's really not as easy as some people may think it is to just leave. And so again, my hope in this space too is a path forward and having these continued conversations.
Yeah, I love that, Kristin. In the summer when we had the femicide in Midland, the one of the articles that was written was titled "He Was a Sweet Boy." And that was the title that the newspaper put out of the article that was speaking about how this man had murdered his girlfriend. And I think that that language is so important, and we see it over and over again in media. And I think that's one of the tangible things that any researcher can do. And I think I'm inspired by hearing all of you speak, and Daniely, to hear from that lens of an academic speaking to this of um, researchers have to also be advocates. So, as a service provider, we wrote to the paper and said, this is unacceptable language. This is why we have to declare intimate partner violence an epidemic. Why wasn't that brought up in this article? And really taking those moments where you see something to say and do something, I think is so important. And I think I'm hopeful to hear the conversation today because it feels like there's a shift into action-oriented research, or research that's trying to mobilize. And I think that's always practitioners. We are often mobilizers trying to get into research. And I think researchers are, researching, trying to mobilize. So it really is a great synergy that gets created. And that synergy gives me a lot of hope. I think in terms of working with individuals who have lived experience of violence, I'd have two pieces of kind of tangible things to do. One is recognize in those moments it's a conversation. I would take away the lens of you are doing research to the lens of you are having a conversation and you are talking with somebody. Because I'll tell you, the most conversation we have in our shelter is in the kitchen when people are cooking and they are doing something. It is not in that counseling office. And the second piece is ask, and not just one of us. If we ask one of us, we often can say, I speak for, women who have experienced violence. I can't. I can speak for Haley MacDonald, and that's it. I can't speak for my sisters who have the most, lived experience similar to mine. And I think that's really important, is that we ask. Women will always tell us, and they have a lot to say.
Thank you, everyone. That was a very insightful conversation, and I know I learned a lot personally, and it's always so nice to hear all these different perspectives and the similar threads that are kind of interwoven between each of your experiences and perspectives. We have some time now to handle any questions from those who are watching. So for those who are watching, if you have any questions for our panel, you can drop them in the question and answer box or in the chat, and we would be happy to answer those now. Okay, I don't think we have any questions. Christy, we might be able to move to the closing slides if you don't mind.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you all so much for such a great conversation. I also I learned so much as well. It's always so moving to hear people speak from their lived experience, and I really appreciate you taking the time this morning. I'm sure our audience feels the same. So thank you again so much for joining us this morning. Thank you to Ashley for facilitating and to all of our amazing speakers. We really appreciate your time. The recording and slides will be available on our website after the event, although there were no slides today, so just the recording. And you will receive a post-event survey. So we do ask that you complete this and share your feedback to help improve future events. And if you would like an attendance certificate that is available, please send me an email. My email is there on the screen, and I'd be happy to provide your certificate. We also just want to promote next week's talk in this series. So next week's talk will be about building a network in IPV research and the importance of community partnerships in amplifying and enhancing research. So we hope to see you then. Until then, thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.